Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and I'm recording this video on Wednesday, December 1, 2021. Last night, I delivered a talk to the Freedom Library, a fantastic organization in Yuma, Arizona, that's long been run by a friend of mine named Howard Blix. And Howard has done fantastic work over the years, educating young people and others. He runs a actual course on the Constitution and on the principles of economic liberty. He's taught just any number of people there in Yuma on these principles, and he gives scholarships away to attend seminars sponsored by free market organizations. He's always done this on the side. That was not his major job or his main job. So other than the think tanks and foundations that promote libertarianism, I don't think there's anybody in the country that has done more to educate people on libertarian principles than Howard Blix. So when he asked me to do this talk, it was actually I think the third time I've given a talk there at the Freedom Library in Yuma. This time it was going to be on Zoom owing to the COVID-19 crisis. Well, of course, I accepted that I hold Howard in the highest esteem. The guy's actually been a big inspiration for me. And so I delivered the talk last night, but unfortunately, Howard forgot to press the record button. And so the talk wasn't recorded. And so I thought, well, you know, the talk is still on my mind, and so I'm going to give it a try and share with you the thoughts that I shared there with the audience last night. That was both via Zoom and they're live in the auditorium. It won't be the exact talk, of course, because it was delivered extemporaneously, just like this talk will be delivered extemporaneously. But by and large, the principles will be the same. So in the year 1776, there occurred two gigantic revolutions. The one revolution that we're all familiar with is the revolution that was reflected in the Declaration of Independence. Where the author of that document, Thomas Jefferson, wrote that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that these rights are endowed in people by nature, and nature's God, that they include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, and that whenever any government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Now, that revolution began on the 4th of July, 1776, and the real significance of that revolution did not lie in the military battles that took place between the English colonists against their own government forces. The real significance lay in the words that I just enunciated. They were shocking words. You know, we sort of take them for granted now because we're so accustomed to them, but when they were expressed in 1776 and they spread around the world, they created an earthquake, and they struck terror in the minds and the hearts of totalitarian rulers, kings, authoritarian dictators all over the world. Because you see, throughout history, people had been taught, they'd been ingrained with the idea that they belonged to the government in which they were citizens or subjects, and that the king or the totalitarian dictator could do whatever he wanted to, that they belonged to him. They were essentially his property. If he wanted to take away their land, he could do it. If he wanted to haul them up to the torture chamber in the Tower of London, he could do it. If he wanted to execute him, he'd just send out his forces and shoot you, or put an arrow through you or a sword through you. There's nothing you could do, because the king essentially owned everything, and everybody, you know, bought into this mindset that they belonged to the king. They were essentially serfs, or in some cases actual slaves. So along comes Thomas Jefferson and says, oh, wait a minute, that's just not the case. That the powers of government are not omnipotent, not in a legitimate sense. That people are vested with these fundamental rights, God-given rights, natural rights, with which no government can legitimately interfere. That these include life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Imagine the pursuit of happiness, a fundamental God-given natural right. And it adheres not just to Americans, it adheres to everyone. Everyone's got this natural God-given right that no government can infringe upon to pursue happiness, each in his own way. And so what Jefferson was doing was actually putting government in a subservient position. In fact, he says that the purpose of government is to protect the exercise of these rights. That's why it's there. And so if it becomes destructive of these rights, people have a right to alter it or abolish it and institute new government that's going to protect the rights. Well, this is not something that omnipotent government kings wanted to hear. I mean, in their mind, they're the masters and the citizenry are the servants. They don't decide how long he's going to stay in power or whether he's going to stay in power at all. That he is there forever and they are subject to his commands. Jefferson threw that notion upside down, threw it out the window. And so that was a revolution of monumental proportions. It continues to strike fear in the hearts of authoritarian rulers all over the world and totalitarian dictators to this day, because it inspires people to say, you cannot do this and you cannot do that, because you're infringing on my fundamental rights that pre-exist you, that pre-exist government. Your job, Mr. Government Official, is to protect the exercise of these rights. Back off. Now, so that was one big revolution. The other big revolution in 1776 is one that is not as well known. And that revolution came in the form of a book. The book was entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And it was written by a Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith. It dealt with economic principles. In fact, this is actually the very first treatise on economics that was ever published. And with this treatise, Smith absolutely shook the world, just like the Declaration of Independence did. It was a shaking of earthquake proportions. You see, prior to the publication of The Wealth of Nations, people had just come to accept the fact that government, that among the legitimate powers of government, of the king or a totalitarian dictator or any government, democratic government, was to protect the citizenry through economic regulations, and especially the poor. That the idea was that the poor need protection from the nobles or the landlords or the landowners, and like in the Middle Ages, and from exploitation. And so there were economic regulations to make sure this didn't happen. For example, in the Middle Ages, there was anti-speculation laws. And what would happen with these is when a farmer was coming to the town for the market to sell his crops, people would go out there to meet him, middlemen, and offer him a price for his crops, and they'd strike a deal, and then the middleman would come over to the fair and charge more than what the farmer was going to charge, and thereby make a profit on what he was doing. Well, the idea was that he's just preying on the poor. And so they didn't want these middlemen, and so they outlawed them. They had anti-speculation laws where middlemen could not go out there and meet the farmer. The farmer would just come in and sell his products, and so you'd cut out the middleman. And the idea here was that, hey, we're protecting the poor. There's also extensive regulations governing the production of certain important items, like sweaters, for example. You know, how would a seamstress or a number of seamstresses acting independently or even together know how many sweaters to produce in society? Suppose they made too few sweaters. People would freeze to death, right? Or suppose they made them all the same color. So you needed a government official that would manage these things, plan these things, figure them out, study them, and say, okay, we need X number of sweaters. These are the colors. Sizes. Got to know how many sizes to make and how many to produce in each size. So they would plan all these things out in excruciating detail. And the idea, again, was to protect society from the vicissitudes of and the chaos of just people managing these things on their own. There was also relief programs. It's like what we call welfare programs today, poor relief programs that would provide assistance to the poor. Because the idea was that without this assistance, the poor would starve to death, and that therefore this was an important function of government, to tax those that had money, tax the rich, in order to assist the poor. Well, along comes Adam Smith in this book, The Wealth of Nations, and says, bunk on all that. He says that actually this is one of the major causes of the misery and suffering of the poor people. The fact that government's out there doing these things for poor people. He says the best thing you could ever do for the poor and everyone else is to just abolish all these programs and all these regulations that just leave economic enterprise alone. That was a shocking notion. It's a shocking notion even today. It shook the world. It's like, that's impossible. You have to have government doing these things. Otherwise, people will be starving in the streets and so forth. And Smith said, no, on the contrary, that if you get government out of economic enterprise, and that's how the term free enterprise originated, enterprise that's free of government control or regulation, that people will be better off. That standards of living will actually rise. The poor will benefit with higher standards of living if you stop government from helping them out. So you have these two revolutionary notions, fundamental rights and the concept of economic liberty. And they work their way in the minds of the American people. And so Americans didn't trust government officials. They had a severe distrust in government officials, and that was reflected by the governmental system that they initially set up called the Articles of Confederation. This was a governmental system where the federal government's powers were so weak, get this, that the federal government did not even have the power to tax people. And that's how our American ancestors wanted it. They didn't want the federal government to have the power to tax people because they figured they're just going to use that power to destroy us. They'll just tax us to whatever they want. So this governmental system lasted for around 10 years or so. But there were problems with it. There were trade wars between the states and so forth. So the delegates met at Philadelphia to come up with ways to improve the Articles of Confederation. But instead they came up with a brand new governmental system, one that became known by the name of a constitutionally limited government republic. And with this governmental system, the federal government's powers were more extensive than they were under the Articles, but still very, very limited. But Americans were leery. I mean, this was not a done deal by any means at all. They were concerned that this new federal government would acquire omnipotent powers. The powers to torture them, the power to execute them, assassinate them, and so they were leery. And under this proposal, the government also had the power to tax. Well, the answer to this that was given to Americans was that, no, look, this is a government that's going to be different from every other government in history. That this is a government whose powers are going to be limited to those powers that are enumerated in the document that calls the federal government into existence. Whoa, well, that's a radical concept. I mean, here are people calling the government into existence and telling it what it can do and what it can't do. And so Americans said, okay, we'll go along with that deal as long as the government's powers are limited. Now, they knew that government would attract the kind of people that are going to try to exercise dictatorial type powers, and that was the purpose of the judicial branch of the government. It would have the power to declare these laws or any actions taken by the president that were violating this limited government concept, that they could declare those laws unconstitutional. But still, Americans were not satisfied. They were very distrustful. They said, well, we want the enactment of a Bill of Rights. And people said, you don't need that because, does the government have the power to destroy freedom of speech, put people in jail for criticizing the government? No, if you look at the Constitution, that's not among the delegated powers, so they can't exercise it. You don't need a First Amendment. Americans said, we want to make sure that they get the message. And so you have the First Amendment that says the federal government cannot do these things, destroy these fundamental natural God-given rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, political rights, the right to assemble, to protest, to petition the government for redress of grievances, Second Amendment, gun control. You don't have the right to take our guns. This is one of those natural fundamental rights. And for people that said, your problem with enumerating certain rights is that the government's going to think that these are all the rights there are. Well, to address that, they enacted the Ninth Amendment that says, hey, just because we're enumerating these rights here doesn't mean we don't have more, like the pursuit of happiness. That's a fundamental right too, and you don't have a right to destroy that for anybody, not just American citizens, because it adheres to everybody, as Jefferson said. And then you've got the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments that deal with criminal justice, that cruel and unusual punishments like torture were prohibited because they knew that government would end up attracting people that wanted to do those kind of things. No executions, extrajudicial executions or assassinations. We see that in the Fifth Amendment. No person shall have his life, liberty, or property taken without due process of law. And that term due process of law stretched all the way back to Magna Carta in the year 1215. So before you could assassinate or execute a person, you'd have to give him notice of what you're charging him with. Why do you want to execute him? And then you have to accord him a trial. And not just any trial, but a trial by jury. That was his option, where the jury would consist of just regular citizens from the community rather than a judge or a tribunal, which they just didn't trust. So this was a highly unusual political system that was being brought into existence here. And when you combine the Declaration of Independence and Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was widely read throughout the colonies, and you come forward to the Constitution with these very limited powers, you end up with a society that is unquestionably the most unusual society that has ever been, that has ever existed. I mean, regardless of what one may say about the American system in the 19th century, everyone has to agree that there's never been such an unusual society as this one, because it incorporated the principles of Smith and principles of Jefferson and brought them together in the society. For example, there was no income tax, no federal income tax at all. You got to keep everything you earned. And this system lasted for more than 100 years. People were free to accumulate unlimited amounts of wealth, and there wasn't anything the government could do about it. And people did. I mean, they multi-millionaires came into existence. In fact, people were going from rags to riches. Poor people were going from rags to riches, sometimes in one generation, but sometimes 2 or 3 generations. They were now their grandchildren or great-grandchildren were now very wealthy from just having saved the money from the money that they were able to keep and the government wasn't taking from them. By the same token, there was no mandatory charity programs, no Social Security, no government assistance to the elderly at all. There was no health care provided for the elderly or the poor, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no health savings accounts. There was no farm subsidies, education grants, no government welfare programs essentially for anyone. Like I say, it was a highly unusual society. This went on for 100 years or so. No immigration controls. People were free to come from all over the world, and there was nothing the government could do about it. Now, if they had tuberculosis or some very dangerous illness like that, or they were insane or something, the government could impede their entry. But most people didn't suffer from that. As long as you were okay, man, they were flooding into American shores. They were leaving the lands where government was controlling and regulating, taking care of them, and controlling economic activity, taking care of them, to come to a land where it was essentially root, hog, or die. I mean, you either made it or you were in trouble. And that's the kind of society people were fleeing toward. There was virtually no economic regulation at all by the government. There were no licensure laws at the state level or at the federal level. If you want to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a hairdresser, or a shoe shine person, or a cobbler, or whatever, you didn't have to get anybody's permission. You just trained, sometimes as an apprentice, or you got educated at some university or school, and then you hung up your shingle. And that was it. That the consumers would decide whether you stayed in business or not the government. So the idea was that the right to pursue an occupation, to sustain your life through labor, was considered a fundamental right, the right that Jefferson talked about. So they were taking Adam Smith's idea of economic liberty, and they were incorporating into Jefferson's concept of fundamental rights and saying the right to sustain your life through labor is a fundamental God-given natural right that government cannot interfere with or infringe upon. There were no minimum wage laws. There was the concept developed of liberty of contract, that you have a right to engage in any contract with anyone, and it's your business. If you want to work for $1 an hour, if you want to work for $20 an hour, as long as you agree with it, you have that right. That liberty of contract was natural and fundamental, and government doesn't have any legitimate authority to interfere with it. There were no 8-hour days, mandated 8 hours days, where employers had to pay overtime if somebody worked more than 8 hours. Again, it was part of the contractual relationship between people. There were no gun control laws. People could keep keep whatever guns they wanted. It was considered a fundamental right, not only to protect yourself from murderers and rapists and thieves, but also to protect yourself from the potential tyranny of your own government. And they were very concerned about their own government becoming tyrannical. Let's see, what else? That about covers it. And this is the kind of system that existed throughout the 1800s. No, let me go back a minute. There was one other concept that I want to emphasize, an important concept, and that's the concept of money. That throughout history, governments had plundered and looted people through inflationary debasement of their currency. That after Gutenberg developed the printing press, governments mandated that paper money, their paper money that the government issued, would be the official money of the realm. And whenever government spent too much money, which it almost always did, the king would spend more than what he was getting in taxes, which would mean that he'd have to borrow the money. But more often than not, what they do is just print the money to pay the excess. Or if they got deeply in debt to fund their forever wars that they were always waging, they would just print the money up and pay the debt off, or pay the soldiers their salaries. Well, what would happen is that this obviously would debase the value of everybody else's money, their savings. If they were on fixed incomes, it would just debase the value of the fixed incomes. It was a way to surreptitiously steal from the citizenry. Instead of taxing them, which could cause a tax revolt, people would just see prices rises, and the price rises were a natural consequence of the debasement of currency. If money is worth less, the only way that it's going to be reflected is by the higher prices of everything that money is buying. But what was beautiful about this kind of system from the standpoint of the king or government officials was that people didn't know that it was the government doing this. They would see the prices rising across the board and blame the store owners or the service providers and saying, oh, they're greedy, they're profiteers, and government would feed into this. The government knew what was going on, but they certainly were not going to tell the citizenry what was going on. They would feed into this by saying, oh, we're going to execute these profiteers and we're going to go after them, prosecute them, and they're just price gouging and they're taking advantage of people, and this is outrageous. And you got the whole concept of wage and price controls, and people would feel like, oh yeah, man, the government's really protecting us. Well, the framers and our American ancestors understood this history. They understood it perfectly, and they saw it during the Revolution with the Continental dollar. They did that themselves. They started printing up all this paper currency that was known as Continentals, and there was a famous saying that it's not worth a Continental, because they had printed so much that it was worthless, essentially. So they decided in the Constitution that this was not going to be happening in American society. So they decided to make gold coins and silver coins the official money of the realm. And you can see that in the Constitution among the delegated powers. There is a power to coin money that's delegated to the federal government. There is no power to print money. Now, coin money means exactly what that means, making coins like gold coins and silver coins. And so that's why the United States in the very beginning had a U.S. mint that was minting coins. Now, from a libertarian standpoint, ideally you would have just let the free market decide this. Let private minters produce the coins and let the market ferret all this out and what people want to use as their money and so forth. But this was the second best system. Now, you often hear that the gold standard meant that America had a paper money backed by gold system. That's absolutely untrue. There was never paper money. The Constitution did not provide for the power to print paper money. It was the power to coin money. Now, the government had the power to borrow money, and so they would issue notes or bills or bonds, but everybody understood that these were promises to pay money. And the money that they promised to pay were gold coins and silver coins. So the real money, the official money of the American people and the Constitution were American eagles, gold eagles, buffalo gold coins, silver dollars, silver quarters. That was the official money of the United States. So, like I say, this was a highly unusual system. You could look throughout history and you'd never find such an unusual system, ever. Also, there was no CIA, no Pentagon, no military-industrial complex, no massive military establishment, no NSA, no FBI. You had a basic military force, enough to, quell attacks by Native Americans and American settlers, but minimal in size and minimal in expenditure, and certainly not large enough to go to Asia or Europe and get involved in their forever wars. So highly, highly unusual system here. Well, then in the late 1800s, you've got new generations of Americans living. Now, I guess this would be like the fourth generation, maybe from 1800 to 1900. First of all, let me say, what the results of this system were. The results of the system were unbelievable economic prosperity. I mean, just what Smith had said. And Smith had said, what he had asked, what are the causes of the wealth of nations? Why are some nations wealthier than others? And this was the answer. The American people figured out the answer. That when you have economic liberty, you're going to have higher standards of living. And that's what happened throughout the 1800s. It starts out slowly because essentially people had nothing or almost nothing in the early days. But as each decade went on, there was more savings, more capital. People became more productive. That additional productivity enabled people to pay higher wages to their employees. So the standard of living overall is soaring by the time we get to 1900. In fact, the period from around 1870 after the Civil War to around 1910, in terms of rising standards of living, was incredible. I mean, there was a reason why poor people from all over the world were flooding into American shores. And this was the reason. They wanted to partake in this. They wanted to get wealthy. And here they had a chance to do that. While in other places around the world, people were mired in poverty. They were still mired in poverty. They were still subscribing to the old mindset that government exists to help the poor and protect the poor and so forth from these economic vicissitudes. But in the late 1800s, things start to shift, and there's a group of Americans that say, we want something different. And they saw the conditions in factories. There, child labor were in the factories. There were wives working long hours in the factories, very unsafe working conditions. And they said, we need government to come in here and establish regulations to protect these poor people. And they're getting exploited. And so that begins this movement to, go back to the olden days of having government come in and take care of people, protect people. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was enacted. This was a law that said that businesses that get too big in the marketplace are dangerous, that they're monopolies, and that they need to be broken up by the government. Well, the advocates of economic liberty were saying, on the contrary, that because a person is successful in the marketplace and he's becoming wealthy because of it, there's no reason to break him up. I mean, that's part of economic liberty, to become as wealthy as you want, so long as your wealth is being produced by virtue of the fact that you're satisfying consumers by giving consumers what they're willing to pay for. And so there was nothing wrong with bigness per se. But the Sherman Antitrust Act took the opposite position. We need to protect people from this phenomenon taking place. Then in 1913, you have the adoption of a federal income tax. It's incredible. Here he'd gone for 100 years where people were free to keep everything they earned, and now you've got, with the adoption of the 16th Amendment and the national income tax, you've got a totally opposite system. Now the government could set the percentage of take anywhere it wanted. If it wanted to take 90%, it could. If it wanted to take 5%. Now they promised, when they were getting this thing proposed, that it would only be imposed on the wealthy. So they were really appealing to people's sense of envy and covetousness. But of course we know how that turned out. I mean, we just look around and see how many middle class people rush to the mailbox every April 15th to get their tax returns filed. And so also in 1913, another big movement was the adoption of the Federal Reserve System. First time a central bank that had the power over printing instruments of indebtedness, bills, notes, and bonds. Phenomenal development, very dangerous development, because in the 1920s, the Federal Reserve, which of course they didn't have much experience in managing money, and even if they had, central planning always produces chaos. That's what Ludwig von Mises pointed out, that socialism, which revolves around the concept of central planning, produces what Mises called planned chaos. And the Federal Reserve's activities in the 1920s were the perfect example of that. They overexpanded the amount of paper in debt, and people started sensing this. And they started thinking, I wonder if the government's going to have all the gold there to satisfy everybody's debt instruments. So they went in there and started demanding gold. And the Federal Reserve panicked over this. They thought, there's going to be massive runs on banks and so forth. So they contract the money supply, or the debt supply, and they overcontract. And that's what caused the stock market crash in 1929. We've often been told that was caused by the failure of America's free enterprise system. They had to say that. I mean, they couldn't blame it on their Federal Reserve System, but that was precisely the cause of that stock market crash. It was not the failure of America's free enterprise system. Now, throughout this time, from the late 1800s to the 1930s, the battle over the future direction of America is being waged fiercely, not only in regular circles, where people are debating and arguing over these concepts, or in the political arena, like whether the income tax or the Federal Reserve should be enacted, but also in the judicial system. There were judges that were standing fast for the concept of economic liberty. One of the most fascinating cases was called the slaughterhouse cases, and you can read the opinions in the slaughterhouse cases online. I highly recommend that you do so. They're fascinating opinions. That what had happened was that the state of Louisiana had enacted a monopoly law that said that there will be only one slaughterhouse in the city of New Orleans. All the competing slaughterhouses were required to close down, and all the butchers would have to use that monopoly slaughterhouse. Now, this was a real monopoly. Okay, this wasn't a business that got big through satisfying consumers. This was a business that had a monopoly privilege to be the only slaughterhouse by virtue of the law. And historically, that was what monopolies were all about. This is why the English people hated monopolies, because the government had set them up, and they were always insulting, abusive. They didn't have to worry about competition. And so monopolies were reviled. So not surprisingly, the butchers that were put out of business by this law filed a lawsuit. Now, there's an important thing to understand about the states with respect to the Constitution. While remember that the federal government is set up as a government of enumerated powers. So if the government wants to exercise a power, you go look at the Constitution and you look at the powers that are delegated. If it's not there, then the government can't exercise it. Okay, so it's free to exercise only those powers that are enumerated. With the states, it's the exact opposite. The states had what were called inherent police powers that adhered to government just through this police power concept that had existed throughout history. That governments can do whatever they want to do so long as it relates to the health, safety, morals, and welfare of the people. Okay, so essentially general police powers. The federal government never had general police powers. Their powers were always limited to the powers that were enumerated in the Constitution. So theoretically, the states could say, enact a law forcing everybody to go to church. There was nothing anybody could do about it because the states were empowered to do whatever they wanted for the health, safety, morals, and welfare of the people. Now, the state constitution might prohibit it. That was certainly a restriction in many states, but they couldn't be restricted by the federal constitution unless there was an express provision for this in the Constitution. And there were express restrictions on the states in the Constitution with respect to several matters. For example, money. The states were not, if you didn't have a restriction, the states could go out and start printing paper money to their heart's content. So the Constitution prohibited them specifically from emitting what they call bills of credit, which was the term they used for paper money. And there was also a restriction that said no state shall make anything but gold coins and silver coins legal tender. So that was how we ended up with this gold coin, silver coin standard throughout the 1800s. Well, the people who file suit on this slaughterhouse case, what do they have to stand on? I mean, the people defending the monopoly say, look, the state has police powers. It can enact any laws it wants. You don't have the authority, Mr. Supreme Court Justice, to get involved in declaring this law unconstitutional. So the defenders of the competitors, they were using a lawyer named Campbell. He was a fascinating guy. He had been a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. And when the Civil War broke out, he felt that it was his patriotic duty to return to the South, which was his homeland, and he gave up his position on the Supreme Court, which was a lifetime position, and went back to fight on behalf of the South. At the end of the war, he was impoverished. He had to start all over again. And one of his cases was this one, the slaughterhouse cases. And so he came up with a brilliant argument, and he was even commended by the justices on the Supreme Court. He said, look, we have the 14th Amendment now, and it's you've got a due process clause there. And of course, due process always meant notice and hearing. And well, he said, no, but it means more than that. The due process means there's fundamental rights that people are endowed with that cannot be taken away by the government. Oh, so you see, now he's hearkening back to Jefferson's concept in the Declaration of Independence. And then he takes Smith's concept of economic liberty and says, economic liberty, the right to pursue an occupation like slaughterhouse, owning a slaughterhouse, is so fundamental a right that the government can't take it away. No state government can do that under this due process clause. So it came to be known by the concept of substantive due process. The analogy would be like if the state enacted an infringement on freedom of speech. The argument would be, well, no, with the 14th Amendment now, this is such a fundamental right, it doesn't have the authority to do that. Well, the competitors lost. The argument held that this fell within the police powers of the states. Later, it was determined that there was massive bribes that had been paid to the legislators in the state of Louisiana to get this slaughterhouse monopoly done. But the fascinating opinions are not the majority opinions, but the dissenting opinions by Justice Field, and I forget who did another one. I think it was Bradley. But it's really worth reading those dissenting opinions because they talk in terms of economic liberty and the right to sustain one's life through labor and so forth. Well, that idea starts percolating into the early 1900s. So you've got a group of judges and justices on the Supreme Court that start bringing this concept up in this fight against the people who were trying to shift America to a society based on economic regulation, economic control, and welfarism and so forth. There was, for example, Lochner versus New York, one of the famous cases here where the state of New York enacted a regulation that was opposed. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and this idea of liberty of contract prevailed substantive due process to protect economic liberty. But the battle continued to be waged. And finally, when the stock market crash occurred in 1929, we get the Great Depression, and that's the watershed period. This was the change in public opinion was like a tsunami. People sometimes have asked me over the years that, well, Jacob, if the Constitution was such a good thing, why didn't it work? Well, it did work. I mean, in accordance with what its purpose was. The Constitution is much like a seawall. It'll protect a community from high tides. Okay, no problem. But it was never designed to protect the community from a tsunami. When the tsunami comes in, you can't say the seawall has failed. That wasn't its purpose. And the same with the Constitution. The Constitution was never designed to protect against a tsunami of public opinion. And that's what happened. You had a tsunami of public opinion that said, we want a welfare state. We want a regulated economy. We want the same type of system that people throughout history have wanted and had. So they were essentially rejecting this unusual society that really stands alone as just this solitary beacon shining through the darkness of history. It's a remarkable period of time when you look at the thousands of years of human history. It's just one society in 100-year period that had this unusual system. But the fight went on. I mean, it was a fierce fight, especially in the Supreme Court. You had Roosevelt enacting his New Deal, which was a system based on extensive economic regulation, welfarism. That's when Social Security came into existence. Here was the first law where the government taxes one group of people and gives the money to another group of people. Akin to those poor relief laws back in the Middle Ages and so forth. And people went along with it. They became very supportive of it. They were surprised because America had never done this, but they went along with it. And it was sold as a temporary measure for the Great Depression, but everybody knew it was going to be permanent. So it was a permanent shift. Roosevelt also nationalized everybody's gold. No constitutional amendment at all. He totally changed the constitutional system on money. So they made paper money, the official money, even though it promised to pay nothing, because owning gold was then illegal. If you got caught owning gold coins, you were guilty of a felony, and they would prosecute you, send you to jail. So you were required to turn all your gold coins into the government, and you received in return paper money, which immediately was devalued and continued to be devalued over the many decades that went on. For some reason, they permitted silver coins to continue to be owned. For a time, they circulated all the way into the 1960s, but ultimately, Gresham's law in economics prevailed. Good money drives out bad money drives out good money, and silver coins were driven out of circulation just because of the massive amount of debased paper money. I mean, if you have 4 silver quarters and 4 alloyed quarters, and you're going to buy a Coke from a Coke machine, you're not going to put your silver quarters in there. You're going to put your alloyed coins in there. So when they nationalized gold and they made paper money the official money, now the Federal Reserve's powers became essentially omnipotent. That they knew that to fund the welfare state that was now being introduced, and the warfare state, the national security state that would come into existence after World War II, they now had the means to do that. Just print unlimited amounts of money, and over decades, the money would be debased, but people would never figure out that it was the Federal Reserve doing this. They would blame it on profiteers and big oil and gas service stations and so forth. Now, the Supreme Court, not all was hunky-dory for Roosevelt. The Supreme Court was declaring much of his New Deal unconstitutional. They were saying this is alien to the American way of life, and it really was. I mean, like his National Industrial Recovery Act was very similar to what Mussolini was doing in Italy to fight the Great Depression, what Hitler was doing in Germany in the 1930s, before the beginning of World War II. Hitler even wrote Roosevelt a letter commending him on his economic programs and his economic philosophy. Hitler said, we agree that we should be looking at the general public, the welfare of the general public, and not the selfish interests of the individual. And in fact, there's a great book called 3 New Deals that I highly recommend you read that compared Roosevelt's New Deal with Mussolini's New Deal and Hitler's New Deal, and it showed the extreme similarities between the 3 systems. So the Supreme Court declares that unconstitutional. So Roosevelt was furious that the Supreme Court wasn't putting its approval on everything he did. He said, I'm trying to save the country here. And so he had his infamous court packing scheme, where he proposed that he would appoint Supreme Court justices. For every Supreme Court justice who was over 70 years of age, he would appoint another Supreme Court justice to relieve their workload. Well, there was no problem with keeping up with workload. That was just a ruse. But there was a tremendous outcry, even among Roosevelt's supporters, for his attempt to tamper with the judicial system. And so that scheme went to defeat. But at the same time, there was 4 justices that you could rest assured they would declare Roosevelt's schemes mostly unconstitutional. They were called the Four Horsemen: Sutherland, Van Devanner, McReynolds, and Butler. And they were pretty consistent. And then there was a swing justice that was joining with them, named Justice Roberts. Well, after the court packing scheme, Justice Roberts switched his vote. And there's explanations for it, defending him, justifying what he did. But judicial historians have come to describe it as the switch in time that saved 9, referring to the 9 Supreme Court justices as compared to the larger number that Roosevelt wanted to do. And so with Roberts' switch, Roosevelt had won. And after that, it occurred in a case called West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, 1937. It was a minimum wage case. And they were battling over whether a state could enact this economic regulation, a minimum wage. And the Four Horsemen said no, but Roberts switched, and they upheld it, 5-4 decision. And they effectively said never again would any law be declared unconstitutional on the basis of economic liberty. So everything shifted at that point. And then the Four Horsemen started retiring or passing away, and Roosevelt started appointing new justices. So that was the end. That was the end of this very unusual experiment. And so, here we are today with that kind of system. Government, the role of the federal government is to regulate economic activity, control economic activity, along with other activity, health, as we've seen with the COVID-19 crisis, massive welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, education grants, on and on. There's a huge number of people that depend on federal largesse, either directly or indirectly. And then we've got a national security state that replaced a limited government republic, where you've got the NSA, the CIA, the Pentagon, the military-industrial complex, to a certain extent the FBI, with omnipotent powers, the powers of assassination, despite what the Fifth Amendment says, the power of torture, the power of indefinite detention, coups, regime change operations, state-sponsored assassinations, on and on, Gitmo. So things have taken a massive shift from this unusual society that once existed. And here we are with massive debt, $28 trillion now in debt. And the Federal Reserve is inflating money like there was no tomorrow. We see that with the rising prices. They're blaming it, once again, as they've done throughout history, on the profiteers, the store owners, the businesses, gasoline stations, big oil, all the standard nonsense, and avoiding any mention of the Federal Reserve as the entity that's expanding this money supply. They're spending and borrowing money as if there were no tomorrow. And this cannot end well. I mean, you look and see what's happening with Argentina right now with their debt load. They're restricting people from leaving the country, not because of COVID, but because they want to keep dollars in the country as a reserve currency. So they're not letting people travel outside because they take their dollars with them and they spend their dollars. So that's what happens when a government goes heavily into debt. Or look at Greece or Italy from a few years ago. So this whole thing's not going to end well. But it provides an opportunity. When you look at all these crises we're facing, immigration crises, a terrorism crisis, foreign policy crisis, monetary crisis, financial crisis, immigration crisis, over and over again we see crises. This is an opportunity for soul searching. And that's what we ought to be doing in this country, is doing some soul searching, is what do we want going forward here? Do we want to continue with this system? Okay, but at least everybody should be aware where this road is taking us, into national bankruptcy and more tyranny and more oppression, more police statism? Or do we want to look at the sound founding principle of this country? Now, we know there were some bad founding principles, slavery, women's rights, and terrorists, and so forth, but there were some good founding principles, at least in accordance with libertarian principles. And what we need to do is look at those sound founding principles, because then the question becomes, do we stay on this same trajectory, or do we start looking at restoring the sound founding principles of this country? And of course, you know what my answer is. My answer is, let's get this country back on the right track,